Our speaker tonight is James FENELON. He served for 10 years as an Army paratrooper, serving in long-range reconnaissance units. He's also a graduate of the Army's Jumpmaster and Pathfinder schools. He's a graduate of the University of Texas in Austin, and he lives with his wife in the Texas Hill Country. This is his second visit to the Round Table in March of 2020, just before everything shut down with COVID. He spoke on his first book, 4 Hours of Fury, the untold story of World War II's largest airborne invasion and the final push into Nazi Germany. The story of the 17th Airborne Division's combat jump across the Rhine in March of 1945. And yesterday, 2 weeks ago, it was exactly 80 years since that happened. That book was praised as riveting and inspiring. He's written for World War II Magazine, Military History, Army, England's Fly Past Aviation Magazine, and other outlets. He served as a technical advisor for World War II documentaries. Our speaker tonight is James FENELON. He served for 10 years as an Army paratrooper, serving in long-range reconnaissance units. He's also a graduate of the Army's Jumpmaster and Pathfinder schools. He's a graduate of the University of Texas in Austin, and he lives with his wife in the Texas Hill Country. This is his second visit to the Round Table in March of 2020, just before everything shut down with COVID. He spoke on his first book, 4 Hours of Fury, the untold story of World War II's largest airborne invasion and the final push into Nazi Germany. The story of the 17th Airborne Division's combat jump across the Rhine in March of 1945. And yesterday, 2 weeks ago, it was exactly 80 years since that happened. That book was praised as riveting and inspiring. He's written for World War II Magazine, Military History, Army, England's Fly Past Aviation Magazine, and other outlets. He served as a technical advisor for World War II documentaries, and he's also consulted as a technical advisor for video games and screenplays. His interest and dedication to the study of World War II combat has taken him to numerous battlefields and historic sites in France, Italy, Belgium, Holland, Egypt, Greece, Germany, and Crete. In tonight's program, he'll speak on his most recent book, Angels Against the Sun, the history of the 11th Airborne Division from the division's formation through its deployment in New Guinea, combat operations in the Philippines, and being the vanguard of landings for the occupation of Japan. Now, we lost our last known 11th Airborne veteran last December. He'd been looking forward to participating in tonight's program. If time allows, I'll read from one of my oral histories after Mr. FENELON's participation from the one 11th Airborne veteran that I interviewed. This will be followed by questions from the audience. So please welcome James FENELON.
Thank you, Doug, for that introduction, and thank you, everybody, for coming out this evening. I greatly appreciate it. I think a great place for us to start before we get going here is with a Pacific War trivia question. Does anybody know or want to guess how many divisions the United States Marine Corps fielded in the Pacific during World War II?
6.
Okay, you guys are Johnny on the spot. Yes, it was 6. Does anybody want to guess how many Army divisions were fielded in the Pacific during World War II?
21.
Okay, 21. This is, I should have known by the name Roundtable, World War II Roundtable, that this was not going to be a guessing game on your part. So yes, 21 Army divisions, and we are going to spend the evening talking about one of those divisions, the 11th Airborne. The 11th Airborne was one of 5 Army Airborne divisions fielded in the war. It was the only one that went to the Pacific. The other 4 obviously went to the European theater. And the best place to start when talking about the 11th Airborne Division is introducing you to the commander, Joseph Swing. Joseph Swing graduated from West Point in 1915. He was commissioned as an artillery officer. And one of his first assignments as a 22-year-old lieutenant was under the command of General Pershing during the Persing Expedition, or sometimes known as the Punitive Expedition, which was the army chasing Pancho Villa around the United States-Mexican border. Now, the reason I start the story here is this is really where we start to see some foreshadowing of how Swing is going to fight his division in World War II. because not only was this his first campaign, if you will, but it was also the time where the Army was undergoing an interesting modernization. So this was the first campaign where the Army was incorporating biplanes into its scheme of maneuver. They were used to deliver messages and conduct scouting operations. They started for the first time trying to move troops on the battlefield using cargo trucks. They had rudimentary light-skinned armored vehicles. And they were also incorporating wireless telegraph for the first time. And now while they were doing this, there weren't any training manuals. There wasn't any doctrine set up for how to do this. And so what Swing and other junior officers were learning while they were in the field during this time was how to improvise and how to adapt the technology on the one hand and the tactics on the other to embrace both of, all of this new technology. Swing also learned a series of cautionary tales during this time around what happens when you don't plan appropriately for logistics. Many times the trucks would break down and no spare parts were on hand, or the trucks would run out of gas. Nobody had thought to bring fuel forward in case of that eventuality, and many mornings the planes just simply wouldn't start. And so Swing learned to become adaptable in these situations, and we're going to see some of his improvisation as we go into his campaign in the Pacific. Not long after this, he was assigned to the 1st Infantry Division as an artillery officer, and he deployed with that division to France as part of World War I. We're going to jump forward to March of 1942, where he was assigned to the 82nd Infantry Division as he had just earned his first star. He was in command of the horse-drawn artillery for the division. And he was with that division when it started to undergo the transformation to become what we know today as the 82nd Airborne Division, which occurred in March of 1942. This is a picture here of Swing in the middle, conducting his first jump. On the far left is General Ridgway, who of course was the commander of the 82nd. The gentleman on the far right is one of my personal heroes, General William Miley. He was the assistant division commander at the time and later went on to command the 17th Airborne Division in Europe. Swing remained with the 82nd as it was going through this transformation until early 1943, when he was tasked with building his own airborne division, the 11th Airborne Division, in February of 1943. He was 51 years old by this time, and his division was modeled the same as the other 4 airborne divisions in the Army inventory, and that is to say it was built around 3 infantry regiments, 1 parachute infantry regiment, and 2 glider infantry regiments. And it's worth noting that one of the big differences between an airborne division and the infantry division was the size. So airborne divisions were about 60% of the size of regular infantry divisions, and this came in the form of they had 2 less infantry battalions in the glider infantry regiments, but it also came at the expense of supply and logistics troops that were not in the airborne divisions, right? This was for 2 reasons. One, they were trying to keep the airborne divisions as light as possible because the goal, again, was to move the division into combat either through parachute or gliders. And then also, this was also based on doctrine. The intention at the time was that they would drop airborne divisions behind enemy lines. They would seize vital objectives such as airfields or bridges, much like we saw in Operation Market Garden. They would link up quickly with ground troops and then be pulled back behind friendly lines to refit and reconstitute for the next mission. So the idea was they didn't need supply and logistics troops as much as other divisions did because they weren't intended to be in the front lines as long as those other units. And so that's where we see some of the difference in the head count. And this is also where we'll see once the division gets into combat some of the challenges they faced being smaller in size than some of these other divisions. Now, the other personality I want to introduce you to that had an impact on the way the division fought in World War II was Orin Hogan. Hogan was the commander of the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment. Hogan is what I call an OG parachute officer or original gangster, if you will. The mug there seen in the middle of the photo was conceived as part of a drinking game that was invented by the officers of the 501st Parachute Infantry Battalion, which was the Army's first organized unit of parachute troops. On that drinking mug, it's made from an artillery shell with 2 reserve parachute handles welded to the side, and this was a drinking game that they called the prop blast. On that mug is a plaque with the names of the Army's original 14 parachute officers engraved on it, and Orin Hogan's name is engraved on it as well. And so he came up through the ranks of the parachute infantry as they were being formed. He started off as a company commander, eventually became full colonel, and took over command of the 511th. The 511th was actually formed before the 11th Airborne Division was formed, so it was a regiment unto itself that was then attached to the 11th once it got formed. And as we see the 11th Airborne's campaign unfold in the Pacific, we can look at Swing for really kind of bringing in improvisational art to the way that they deployed their campaign, and we can look at Haugen for really the raw aggression with which the troops fought, and we'll kind of see how that combined to create a very unique fighting style for the 11th Airborne Division. Now, it's worth taking a minute to talk about how the division got its nickname, the Angels. And so as Swing formed the division, with the exception of the 511th, the division was pretty much all trained and went through basic training and advanced training all at the same time. So much of the unit was out at the same time also getting passes and going out onto town. And this is where you have to understand and think back to your own self as a 19-year-old man. The average age of the enlisted men at the division at this time was 19 years old. These guys start getting passes out onto the town. They're away from home for the first time. They're with their buddies. They discover alcohol. And so it was on a Monday morning that one of Swing's officers euphemistically asked, "How many of our angels are still in jail this morning?" And that is kind of how the nickname came about. That became his morning routine. Guys started repeating that, and pretty soon Swing was referring to his men as my angels. And these photos, I think, do a good job of kind of capturing the spirit, the high-natured spirit of the guys in the 11th Airborne Division. That picture on the left is a group of glider infantrymen who got bored in the field, so decided that they were going to go hunt wild boar. They attached bayonets to their rifles and used them as spears and basically chased down these 2 wild boars and speared them to death. Another group of glider infantrymen on field exercises in Louisiana decided that they wanted to supplement their morning rations with bacon, and so they staged a bayonet attack on a farmer's pig farm, and quickly then found out that they were going to have to pay that farmer back for that. And then one of my favorite World War II pictures is this picture of Willard Lamb here in the middle. He was a mortarman in the 511th, and if you look very closely, you will see that his left ear is pierced, which is a very rare photo from World War II, I guess you could say. But Willard Lamb and his entire platoon went out one night, got drunk, and they all got their ears pierced. All 30 of them came back to base with their ears pierced. And so this is where we see the Angels' reputation kind of coming into play. And so Swing recognized that he had a young division. As I said, their average age was 19. He wanted to figure out a way to kind of harness this youthful energy, to give the men an excuse to hang out on base and get in trouble rather than go out on the town and get into trouble. And so he started a very robust division-level sports program. So every unit had football teams, basketball teams. Boxing was a very popular pastime, and the intention here again was to give these guys an outlet for all their energy. But the other thing that Swing did at this time was he established his own division-level jump school. And so, as I mentioned previously, the division was built predominantly around 1 parachute infantry regiment and then 2 glider infantry regiments with supporting units of artillery, medical, engineers, etc. And what Swing wanted to do was he wanted to do 2 things with this division-level jump school. First, he wanted to give all of the non-jumpers in the division the opportunity to volunteer to go through a 5-day jump school. They could earn their parachute wings and additionally start to get additional parachute pay, which was $50 a month, which was not an insignificant sum in World War II. But he also had another intention in mind, which is that he wanted to have the flexibility so that he could determine the best way to deploy his men into combat. And so he figured if he could have as many parachute qualified troopers as possible along with his glider troops. He could then pick which units or how the best way to deploy them into combat. And so using this benchmark, at the height of this training, the division, 72% of the enlisted men within the 11th Airborne Division had gone through jump school, and 82% of the officers were also parachute qualified. So you could make it a pretty strong argument, in my opinion, that using that criteria, the 11th Airborne Division was the most airborne of the airborne divisions in World War II. And we're going to see some of the unique ways that Swing put that capability into practice. Now, the final training station for the 11th Airborne was at Fort Polk, Louisiana. At that time, the troops did not know where they were going to be deployed. They were ordered onto trains in mid-1943. Once the trains started leaving Louisiana, they were heading north. That train then veered left or west, and that is when the men understood that they were heading to California and ultimately going to be sailing into the Pacific. Now I'm going to start with this map of the Pacific in 1942, in the shaded area shows the Japanese high mark, if you will, in 1942 as they expanded out of Japan across the Pacific. And then you'll see the State of the Pacific campaign when the Angels arrived in New Guinea. So you've got basically, and this is just an oversimplified explanation of what happened. Andrew did a fantastic job of explaining this in more detail earlier this evening. But Admiral Nimitz was pushing across on the northern boundary. MacArthur's campaign was coming up through New Guinea with the destination of the Philippines. When the Angels landed on New Guinea in May of 1944, it had largely been secured. They were set up there as a reserve division awaiting orders to deploy. But Swing and Hogan took advantage of this time in New Guinea because the big advantage they had while they were there is they could start training on terrain that was going to be very similar to what they would experience on other Pacific islands. They also had the advantage of veteran troops on New Guinea, which they could learn from. So there were several other Army units that were in New Guinea. Swing also took the opportunity to send as many of his men as possible through a jungle warfare school run by the Australians. He sent many members of the division's recon platoon through the famed Alamo Scout School that was on New Guinea as well. And then the training kind of accumulated in a series of live fire exercises at the battalion level. So infantry battalions were combined with artillery, combat engineers, and they conducted a series of live fire exercises. And we know these were realistic because unfortunately several of the men were killed in action during these exercises on New Guinea, but it served as a great training ground, much more realistic than what they were able to experience in the States, and it set them up for their first deployment. Now, that first deployment, much to their disappointment, was to land as a reserve division on Leyte well after the action had already started. So in October of 1944, MacArthur made his famed return to the Philippines, fulfilling his pledge of I shall return, the famous speech he made from Corregidor. He landed several divisions on Leyte Island in the Philippines. That occurred on the west coast of the island with several divisions. A month later, the 11th Airborne landed down at Beto Beach. And as I said, they weren't initially expected to perform a combat role on Leyte. And the reason for that was that MacArthur and his staff had concerns due to the smaller size of the 11th Airborne Division that they weren't going to be able to sustain their campaign once they landed on the island. As I'm sure you're all familiar with the island hopping campaign, logistics was a vital component of that. This bottom picture on the other side of the screen shows several supply ships beached on Leyte. And pretty much the scheme of maneuver was divisions were responsible for getting their own supplies up from the beach. And so MacArthur and staff were concerned that for Swing to do that, he would need to either strip riflemen from his frontline units to bring them back to the beach to help bring those supplies forward, or he's going to be too slow because he didn't have the supply troops to bring them forward, and it would take him longer, and thus the 11th would have a harder time keeping up with the rest of the campaign. But as things unfolded on Leyte, the Japanese were landing thousands of reinforcements over on the east coast at Ormoc. And the island was divided by a very rugged mountain chain. So you might be able to see it here on the map. We're going to talk a lot about that mountain range here in a minute. And so to cut those reinforcements off, MacArthur came up with a plan to launch a pincer attack where he was going to move some of his divisions up and around the island to the north. They were going to go all the way up and then come back down on the west coast. And then other divisions were going to go down and go around the mountains to the south and come up on the west coast as well. These units couldn't get up into the mountains because there were no roads. They're extremely steep mountains, and so there was no way to kind of logistically get these divisions where they needed them to go. So the 11th got the task of initially setting up blocking positions up in the mountains. So think of the 11th at this time as essentially one of the first truly light infantry divisions, right? They're going up into the mountains on foot, and they're going to set up blocking positions. That mission changes very quickly, and MacArthur orders Swing to have his men bisect the island and cut their way across that mountain range. I'm going to pause on this slide for a minute just because I want to kind of orientate you to the map so that we can follow along as what happens. But first, I want to point out the elevation drawing on the bottom there to kind of give you an idea. As the Angels started cutting their way across the island from right to left, you can see that the terrain grew increasingly steep. Many of the Angels recalled standing on the island and being able to put their hand out and touching the mountain in front of them as they were working their way up these trails. So it was extremely rugged terrain. And this is really where the 11th found themselves going toe-to-toe with the Japanese and all of the modern conveniences that the United States Army had as far as superior firepower, tanks, close air support. They weren't really able to take advantage of any of that because of the terrain. The jungle made it difficult for pilots to see targets. The maps of Leyte at this point were literally hand-drawn, so they were incredibly inaccurate, which means that you don't really want to call heavy artillery down because you don't actually have any idea where you are, let alone where the artillery is going to land. And so the first item I want to point out here on the map is that first red dot on the east coast, Burin. So this is where Swing set up his division forward command post. That's going to be an important part of this story. And then the second one is the middle red dot at Montserrat, right here, which is where Hogan is going to set up his forward command post as his regiment is on the vanguard of moving through and pushing across Leyte Island. So both of those locations are going to play a part of the story, so just kind of keeping those in mind as we go forward. And then also it's kind of an interesting concept to think of. When we think of the island hopping campaign, right? The idea is you're jumping from island to island to set up bases. Swing's campaign in the mountains was similar in concept in that Hogan, once he was in the jungle, realized that they were going to have to move from mountain to mountain, ridge line to ridge line, because that was the best way to defend themselves against the Japanese. Because basically what's happening is the 511th is cutting across the island, and they're behind Japanese lines almost the entire way. So this became their own kind of mini island hopping campaign, if you can think of it that way, of going from hilltop to hilltop, or in this case, mountaintop to mountaintop. And it wasn't long into that jungle trek that, of course, they experienced their first contact with Japanese infantry up in the mountains. The Angels learned very quickly not to underestimate the Japanese and began very early on in this campaign to appreciate the speed at which Japanese infantry would move through the jungle. And I think that experience can best be understood by looking at the experiences of Elmer Frier, who was a member of the 511th. He was considered the quote-unquote old man of his company because he was 31 years old. He was an experienced soldier. He had actually done 2 tours in the Marine Corps before the war, and then he enlisted to volunteer as a paratrooper. His company was moving along a jungle trail early on in the campaign when they bumped into a Japanese unit. Frier's company commander decided to conduct a fighting withdrawal back to a hilltop to where they could establish themselves on an all-around defense on that hilltop. Frier and several others stayed behind to conduct a rear guard action, if you will, holding back the Japanese as best they could while the main element moved back to a hilltop. As Frier, he was next to a machine gun crew. A hand grenade went off as the Japanese were trying to take out that machine gun crew. The gunner was severely lacerated by shrapnel and got up to run back to find medical treatment. He was bleeding so badly he couldn't see which direction he was going, so he actually started running towards the Japanese lines. Frier left his position of cover tackled that guy, brought him back into their small perimeter, gave him first aid. Frier was shot twice during this action after he exposed himself to cover. He then got the guys moving up the trail. Frier was later credited with killing 27 of the Japanese with his M1 Garand rifle, and so I think that's just a testament to marksmanship. 27 guys is basically a platoon. They were moving their way up the trail. All of the men with Frier, and this is about 4 or 5 guys, were all wounded at this time. The Japanese, they could see the tan uniforms flashing through the jungle on both sides of the trail. The Japanese goal was to get around in front of them to cut them off from the main element. At this time, a Japanese soldier crashed through the underbrush and leveled his submachine gun at Frier's platoon leader. Frier threw himself between the 2 men and took the full burst in the chest. And with his dying actions, he pulled a pin on a hand grenade and killed his assailant. Frier was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for this action, and unfortunately, he remains missing in action to this day. His buddies were just too wounded to carry his body. The rest of the men did make it up and rejoin the perimeter, but when they went back for Frier, they couldn't find his body. So this is just one example of many combat experiences faced by the 11th as they pushed their way up into the mountains. And as I mentioned, Hogan set up his forward command post at that second dot on the map called Montserrat. Now this is where the prophecy, if you will, of MacArthur's staff not having the confidence that the 11th was going to be able to sustain their campaign was on the verge of coming true, because you have those rugged mountains. The 511th, the entire regiment has pushed their way up into the jungle. The only way to get them resupplied at this time is guys bringing up rations and ammunition and medical supplies on foot behind them. There were only 6 C-47s available for supply missions on Leyte, and that was they were responsible for supplying over 6 divisions on Leyte. So getting your hands on one took a lot of time, a lot of paperwork. MacArthur would not let them fly without fighter escort, and so it became a logistical burden. And again, Swing not wanting to slow down the campaign, took to an innovative step of pressing his division's artillery observation aircraft into the role of becoming supply aircraft. And so when Hogan arrived at Montserrat, it was a small clearing on the top of one of those mountaintops. The men started chopping down trees to try to slowly expand the size of the footprint of that drop zone. And if you look on this photo, you can see this little dot underneath that observation aircraft is not a glitch in the photo. That's actually a box of ammunition being thrown out the back of that plane. And so the 11th Airborne Division had about 8 of these aircraft. And that, like I said, they were originally intended to be artillery observation aircraft. So think of this basically as an aircraft that is like a lawnmower with wings. It's very rudimentary, had one pilot up front, an observer was supposed to be in the back seat with a radio to call back and adjust artillery fire. Swing loaded up the lightest guys that he had in the division. They were actually members of the division band. They would sit in the back seat, and the pilot would fly them low over the drop zone, and then the guy in the back seat would throw out ammunition or rations or what have you. But Swing knew that he needed to increase the size of this drop zone. He needed to increase the tempo of this resupply mission. So he grabbed a platoon of his combat engineers who had gone through the division level jump school, and one by one they loaded in the back of one of these observation aircraft with their parachute. And so think about that for a second. Like, this is smaller than a VW Bug. Like, I don't know what the comparison is, but it's small. And they had to take the doors off. They had to sit in there with their bulky parachute. They basically took their static line and wrapped it around the spar that was welded to keep the seat in place. The plane would then putter over the drop zone, and one at a time, these guys would drop out. So it took 30 sorties of around 8 aircraft to get these engineers up into the mountains. These guys then started using demolitions to expand the size of that drop zone. You can see this middle photo at the top is basically what the aid station looked like. So this is where the wounded are recovering up there. There was really no way to evacuate them at this time. Swing did have a handful of surgeons that had gone through the division jump school in New Guinea, so they dropped 4 surgeons into Montserrat as well, where these guys set up a first aid surgical station up in the mountains. But then the next problem was, okay, you've got this forward supply base now. It's growing in intensity as far as, you can imagine if you're dropping only 1 or 2 crates of ammunition or 1 or 2 crates of rations per sortie, these planes are just flying over the forward base there constantly. And they had to deal with weather issues. A lot of times the mountains were covered in fog or clouds. Haugen couldn't push forward because he needed his infantry to now set up a perimeter around this base. They're still behind Japanese lines. So Swing again reaches into his arsenal and designates a company of his glider infantrymen who have gone through airborne school. And he starts dropping in 120 guys, 1 guy at a time, from these observation aircraft. This company of glider infantry now set up and establish the perimeter on the base so that the 511th can then push out and keep moving across the mountain. Now, as I mentioned, Swing was an artillery officer. Swing loved firepower, loved howitzers, and always was in shock how infantrymen didn't grasp shock and awe of artillery. And so he wanted to get artillery up into the mountains to support Haugen. And the division had a number of smaller 75 millimeter howitzers. And Swing finally got his hands on one of those C-47s. They slung the 75 millimeter howitzers on the bottom of the C-47, and the drop zone had now expanded big enough to where they could make a single pass to drop a howitzer, and then the plane would come back around, and then the 5 crew members would jump out into the drop zone as well. And this took, all told, about 5.5 days. They dropped 4 75 millimeter howitzer, their crews, and about 300 rounds of artillery ammunition up there in the mountains to then give Haugen some firepower as he started to make his way across the island. And so if we pause here for just a second and kind of use the old adage that a picture is worth 1,000 words, I want to take a minute to talk about this young man. This is Paul Hall. He was a 20-year-old paratrooper. This photo was taken on Leyte. And I think it does a great job of kind of illustrating for us the conditions under which the guys in the 11th Airborne Division were fighting on the island. If this photo was in color, you would see that his skin and the whites of his eyes were yellow from all the quinine that he was taking to stave off malaria. So the 11th, like all troops, frankly, in the Pacific, started taking quinine on the ships on their way over to the Pacific. It had a tendency to turn the skin yellow. They continued to take it throughout their time in the Pacific to avoid malaria. You'll also notice that he's not wearing a shirt. The reason he's not wearing a shirt is probably because he doesn't have one. The 11th Airborne, the entire time they were on Leyte, they basically were subjected to rainstorms every day. When it wasn't raining, it was hot and humid, so the guys were sweating, and their uniforms just started coming apart at the seams. And so most of the men of the 11th didn't have shirts. It's not uncommon to find pictures of them where they're wearing nothing but combat boots and shorts, and the shorts were just where they cut their pant legs off because the bottoms the knees had worn out, etc. And again, because that supply line for Swing was so tenuous, you weren't bringing up extra uniforms and boots. You were bringing up ammunition, rations, and medical supplies, and so guys were very rarely resupplied with luxuries such as uniforms. You can tell that Paul here is probably getting ready to spend the night in his foxhole. If you look at his belt, you'll see that he's got a couple of hand grenades there. So the Japanese were infamous for probing American lines at night and taunting American troops by either yelling at them or shooting into the dark as a way to try to get the Americans to give up their positions by shooting back. And of course, muzzle flashes at night are a great way to let everybody know where you are. And so hand grenades were a vital element of foxhole defense at night because you can throw a hand grenade at a sound and it will explode without giving away the position of where that hand grenade was thrown from. So hand grenades were an important element at night, as was his bayonet-tipped M1 Garand. As I mentioned, the Japanese were kind of infamous for infiltrating at night. So bayonet fighting was not uncommon. A lot of soldiers could tell you nightmare stories of suddenly a Japanese soldier appearing on the edge of their foxhole with either their own bayonet-tipped rifle or a sword. And so guys always wanted to have their rifle at the ready to parry any kind of sudden attack that came out of the dark. And then lastly, you'll notice that by Paul's right knee is his helmet. Sentries at night in their foxholes did not wear their helmets because they wanted to have their full range of hearing. But they did want to keep their helmet nearby for a couple of reasons. One was if you were quick, you could use your helmet to throw it over a Japanese hand grenade that all of a sudden landed in your foxhole. Foxholes in the Pacific were always muddy, so it was easy to shove a hand grenade down into the mud. Japanese hand grenades were not nearly as powerful as American hand grenades, so if you were fast enough, you had a pretty good chance of minimizing the hand grenade's impact. And then what's more telling, though, about the helmet is that when you're in a foxhole at night in the Pacific against the Japanese, what you do not want to do is get out of your foxhole. Many Americans were sadly killed by their friends who got out of their foxhole at night, were wandering around the perimeter, and were in a situation where it was shoot first and ask questions later. Sadly, several troopers were shot by their own unit. So the helmet served as what the men referred to as a thunder bucket. And this was what they used to relieve themselves at night so that they didn't have to leave their foxhole. And so I think that's just, and Paul, in case you want to know, Paul did survive the war. But I think this is a great picture that kind of illustrates a lot with just a single photo of what those conditions were like. Now, it wasn't too long into the 11th Airborne Division's campaign on Leyte that both Swing and General MacArthur learned that the 11th weren't the only paratroopers on Leyte. On the evening of December 6th, 1944, right as the sun was going down, this was near Swing's base camp, that first red dot that we talked about at Burin. Several transport planes came in buzzing low over the jungle. The men initially thought that they were American C-47s, but as the planes got closer, they could see the Japanese markings on these planes, and the Japanese dropped about 800 paratroopers onto Swing's rear area division headquarters. Their mission was to attack and destroy what they thought was MacArthur's land-based aircraft. So in this area, Swing had taken advantage of 3 unused airfields, and they were unused because of the torrential rains had made them basically into muddy quagmires. And so heavier aircraft like P-38s, the B-25 bombers couldn't land on these airfields, but they were perfect for Swing's light observation aircraft. So he had turned these 3 airfields into basically supply dumps. They were bringing in supplies from the coast, dropping them here, loading them into those observation aircraft one at a time to fly them up into the mountains. The Japanese thought they were going to find and destroy what they were expecting to be MacArthur's land-based aircraft. The idea was that MacArthur was using carrier-based aircraft, and the carriers aren't going to hang out indefinitely. And so MacArthur was looking for a place to move this aircraft so he could have land-based aircraft for his next campaign and to help support this. So the Japanese didn't find those, but what they did find was all of Swing's observation aircraft. So they intently went about their business of demolishing all of those using satchel charges and machetes. And now Swing had 800 Japanese troops just literally cut off his supply line. So they also were igniting any of the supplies they found around the airfield. Swing pressed into service some of his combat engineers. He had hit one of his artillery battalions leave their artillery pieces and attack as infantry. And he also had a regular infantry battalion that had just landed on the coast assigned to him to help go in and destroy these Japanese forces that had taken over the airfields. Now, Japanese paratroopers are just as stubborn as every other Japanese soldier on the battlefield, and all told, it took about 7 days for them to secure this area and obtain control of the 3 airfields. Now, this has a ripple effect on the guys in the field because as we've seen, the supply chain is extremely tenuous. And so what's happened is, as soon as these Japanese troops landed, Swing radioed Montserrat and told them to hold in place. And Hogan had already left. Hogan had already pushed the regiment forward into the mountains, and so the 511th went about 5 days without any rations. They had left without any, expecting that they would be resupplied on the march. That didn't happen because of the Japanese attack here at the rear area base. They resecured the airfields, resumed their campaign across the mountains. The 511th emerged on the far side of Leyte Island on Christmas Day, 1944. And at this point, MacArthur had already started planning his next major move of the campaign, which was to secure and seize the island of Luzon. And Luzon was the main island in the Philippines. It's where the capital city of Manila is located. And when we think of Manila, you should remember that its pre-war nickname was the Pearl of the Orient. It had about 800,000 to 1 million inhabitants. And when we think of the capital city, you should also think of the buildings that we see in Washington, D.C., right? These very large neoclassic structures. Many of those architects had also architected buildings that were in Manila. It had a wide boulevard that went around the bay where families at night or in the evenings would stroll along to watch the sunset. It was a very metropolitan, very dense urban population, and MacArthur had hoped that the Japanese were going to declare Manila an open city. And by open city, we mean that they were going to withdraw from the city so that the fighting would not take place in that urban area, similar to what MacArthur had done himself when he was forced to evacuate from Manila. They held off on that peninsula across the bay from that. Well, everybody underestimated the Japanese. The Japanese did not declare Manila an open city. They instead started to fortify it and barricade themselves into these buildings. MacArthur landed 2 divisions to the north on January 2nd in 1945. His campaign started to slow down. It wasn't going as fast as he wanted. MacArthur had very big plans for his return to Manila, which included a parade. And so he wanted to get there. And so he turned to Robert Eichelberger, this gentleman seen on the slide here. Robert Eichelberger was kind of known as MacArthur's fireman. He was the guy that MacArthur called in when he needed additional action to take place. He's one of the most underrated Army commanders in the war, in my opinion. But he and Swing, Eichelberger and Swing got along very well. Swing had proposed a plan to drop the division in its entirety just south of Manila. Eichelberger liked this idea, but the reality was they couldn't get their hands on enough aircraft to drop an entire division. And so they came up with what Swing would later refer to as an end run with a pass, or half a loaf is better than nothing. And this is where we see again Swing's kind of flexibility. And so what he and Eichelberger decided to do was they were going to land most of the 11th Airborne Division amphibiously down along the coast down here. And then Eichelberger was managing some other landings simultaneously. The idea was that these would draw and split the Japanese defenses so that the original divisions that landed up north could have an easier way of making their way into Manila. Now, Swing and Eichelberger's plan was to land the 2 glider infantry regiments amphibiously along with the other troops. They were going to push in towards that lake that you see down there along the bottom. And then they were going to drop the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment along that ridge called Tagaytay Ridge. And so that's what they did. Once the glider infantry landed, they engaged some fairly significant resistance by Japanese troops that were holding the high ground there. And on 2 days in, the 511th made their way into the combat area via C-47. Hogan was standing in the door of the first aircraft. He was the first to jump for the regiment. They landed just on top of Tagaytay Ridge. They made a quick link up with the glider infantry, and then Swing dispatched them, moving them north to attack Manila from the south. Now, so this next map shows basically the 11th Airborne Division's route into southern Manila. So if you think at the very top there where you kind of see some of the gray area, that's where the city center of Manila is to the north there. So the 11th Airborne Division is pushing their way up. The 511th is on the left side there, pushing their way up, and then the glider infantry is coming around on the right flank. Now, I want you to kind of watch this map because it's going to transition in a second through the power of animation, and we're going to see the Japanese positions overlaid in this route. And this is where all of the Japanese positions had originally been set up. They had expected the Americans and MacArthur to attack the city from the south. This was codenamed the Genko Line. These 3 photos of Japanese machine gun positions were actually taken from after-action reports of the 11th Airborne Division. So these are very representative of the obstacles that they faced. A lot of those red dots on the map there represent anti-aircraft guns that were dug in and leveled to engage ground targets. The Japanese were also stripping naval guns off of ships that had been sunk in Manila Harbor, brought them in, dug them into the defensive line. They would take buses and flip them over in the middle of an intersection, rig them with barbed wire between lampposts. They buried hundreds of aerial bombs in intersections and rigged them as landmines. And so this was what the 11th Airborne was facing as they now moved into the urban area of Manila. Looking at the experiences of just one of those fights, we're going to talk about Robert Steele. He was in the vanguard of Hogan's push into the environs of Manila. He was a 22-year-old paratrooper from Los Angeles. Interestingly enough, his brother was also fighting in Manila, but he was coming in from the north with the 1st Cav Division. Steele's unit was pushing their way into Manila when they became engaged by a group of Japanese that was occupied in an old Spanish barracks. And so when you think of this barracks, think of a low retaining wall all the way around it made out of stone. The barracks itself was made out of 4-foot thick stone walls. The Japanese were inside of it. They had the overlook position on a bridge that Haugen was trying to get across to push into Manila. And basically it turned into a stalemate. The first attempt by the 511th to storm the building resulted in several guys getting killed. They had fallen back and were sitting around the retaining wall. The Japanese were inside. They weren't giving up. They weren't coming out. The stalemate ensued. The pressure was on to keep moving into Manila. Steele decided after a couple hours that he would break the stalemate himself. He went over to one of the jeeps, grabbed an axe and a 5-gallon jerry can of gas, jumped the retaining wall, scurried across the courtyard, climbed up the outside of the barracks, used the axe to chop a hole into the roof of the barracks, then emptied the 5 gallons of gas down inside, and then threw a thermite grenade to set the entire thing on fire, then unslung his Thompson submachine gun and sat up there on the roof shooting anybody who stayed inside of the building. So the Japanese now had the choice of either burning to death inside or fleeing. Of course, if any of those that left the building were cut down by Steele's comrades outside of the building. Sadly, Robert Steele was killed 2 weeks later in the battle for Manila, and he lies in the American cemetery in Manila next to his brother, who was also killed in the battle for Manila. He was posthumously awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions that day. Now, we can't really talk about the 11th Airborne Division's campaign in Luzon without also spending some time talking about the Filipino guerrillas. The Filipino guerrillas really deserve as much attention and acclaim as the French resistance does in terms of rescuing down pilots, conducting intelligence missions for MacArthur, general harassment and sabotage of Japanese efforts in the lines, or behind the lines. Not long after Swing had landed, amphibiously, when he landed on Luzon, several Filipino guerrilla commanders presented their units to Swing for integration into his campaign, and Swing readily accepted their help. Because again, if we think about, the supply challenges, the running joke in the 11th Airborne Division's headquarters was our front line is 200 yards wide by 54 miles deep. Because they landed on the beach, came up, they linked up on Tagaytay, and then pushed their way up to Manila. So it's like, think of it as a giant L-shaped front line. That supplies, again, are being landed on the coast. They have to make their way inland and then up into Manila. This is, again, where we see an all-hands-on-deck kind of situation. Swing's finance officer was made famous for the number of mortar shells that he actually hustled up that highway on foot. And so where the guerrillas came into play, they served a number of functions. First, several of them were attached to each of the platoons up front on the front line in Manila. These guys, of course, were all local, so they knew their way around, which is an important asset to have when you're fighting through an urban labyrinth such as Manila. And then they were also responsible for patrolling and protecting that supply line. So these guerrillas were really instrumental in making sure that the Japanese weren't able to cut those supply lines. And if you look closely on the guy on the far right, if you look over here, you can just make out that he's wearing an 11th Airborne Division patch on his left breast pocket. This was something that Swing organized. He made sure that all the guerrillas under his command were issued division-level patches. This not only helped, obviously, identify them, but he also wanted to make sure that they felt like they were part of the unit. All told, the 11th Airborne Division had close to 2,000 guerrillas helping them out. That's essentially a regiment. So again, this is where we start to see the guerrillas helping the 11th to really punch above their weight in this campaign. And without them, it's unlikely that Swing would have been able to maintain the momentum of his campaign into Manila. Another unique aspect, or I should say another unique mission that the 11th conducted on Luzon was the rescue of several thousand civilian internees. Now, as the campaign in Luzon developed, MacArthur started to get concerned that the Japanese, who had several civilian internee camps on the island as the Japanese were being pushed back across the island, rather than evacuating these civilians with them or more ideally just letting them go, that they would execute the civilians in these camps. Now, when I say civilians, think of the surprise of the Japanese invasion in 1942. These are American contractors, engineers, clergy, missionaries, French, Belgian civilians with their wives and kids who were rounded up and captured by the Japanese and put in these camps. And so MacArthur wanted to make sure that the internees at Los Banos, which was about 22 miles behind the Japanese lines at this time, were not executed by their guards. And so he tasked the 11th Airborne Division with conducting a rescue mission. That mission got started at 07 in the morning after reconnaissance troops with guerrillas had infiltrated in and set up a perimeter around the camp. Their signal to start the attack was the opening parachute of the first jumper out of 9 C-47s. Swing dropped a company of infantrymen on the outskirts of the camp. So while the Japanese guards and everybody in the camp is looking up at these C-47s coming in at 500 feet, the recon troops and the guerrillas initiated their attack. About 120 guys jumped in. As soon as they hit the ground, they then rushed into the camp as well to join in the attack. Simultaneous to this, several dozen amphibious tracked vehicles made their way ashore and started heading directly to the prison camp. Amazingly, in the crossfire, none of these civilian internees were killed. There were 2,147 of them that were rescued in this mission. A couple of them were wounded in the crossfire, but miraculously none of them were killed. Sadly, 2 of the guerrillas were killed by Japanese sentries. And then as quickly as they got there, they started loading the civilian internees into these amphibious vehicles. The guys on the ground loaded up with them, and they withdrew back across the lake where they came. And it's really an interesting thing to think about, especially when we think about modern raids and the amount of the amount of effort and planning that goes into that. The guys that conducted this rescue mission the day before were on the front lines fighting the Japanese. They were given about 6 hours to study maps and prepare their parachutes and get everything ready. And then literally the next day, they were all back in the front lines doing their thing. And it was also an interesting aside. This was also the beginning of the 11th Airborne Division's one-sided rivalry with the Marine Corps. And I say that it's one-sided because I don't think that the Marines actually ever knew that they were in a rivalry with the 11th Airborne Division. But what happened was these guys had done this, amazing feat of arms. They had rescued over 2,000 civilians. They were expecting that the next day on the Stars and Stripes, they would have the front page news. But instead, when they got their issue of the Stars and Stripes delivered, it was emblazoned with that famous picture of the Marines raising the flag at Mount Suribachi, pushing the Angels to page 3. And so it was basically for the rest of their lives, the 11th Airborne Division blamed the Marine Corps for stealing their press and their headlines. So we're going to fast forward. The campaign on Luzon continued at a blistering pace. Swing was instrumental in pushing his division along with his guerrilla regiment across the island. But when the war ended, we finally see that the size of the 11th Airborne Division comes into their favor. Swing tasks them with being the first troops to land outside of Tokyo to seize the airfield at Itsugi. This is where MacArthur himself is going to land before he goes to accept the final surrender terms on the USS Missouri. The men were loaded up into aircraft in Manila, flown to Okinawa. They stayed several days in Okinawa while the final details of the surrender were worked out. They then loaded aircraft, as you can see on this photo on the left, to fly into Tokyo. Now, it's important to put some context here. There was not a single guy in the 11th Airborne Division that thought he was ever going to leave Japan. They all thought that they were going to be ambushed, that there was no way that the Japanese were going to give up. They had been fighting them for a long time. They knew the Japanese did not ever surrender. And of course, they had heard for years the Japanese propaganda that the Japanese were going to fight for every last man, woman, and child on the island. So a lot of them had resigned themselves that this was a trap and that they were the bait. You can see this first guy getting on the plane has his .30 caliber machine gun. So they went in fully armed, fully expecting a fight. But fortunately, as one of the Angels later observed, the Japanese surrendered as hard as they fought. When they landed, there were no incidents. They secured the airfield. MacArthur landed, and as we all know, the surrender terms were signed on the USS Missouri. All told, the 11th Airborne suffered about 30% casualties during their campaign in the Pacific. That includes about 614 killed in action, and 11 of the Angels still remain unaccounted for today and are on the wall of the missing in action in the cemetery of Manila. And it is in their honor that I wrote Angels Against the Sun. And I leave you with a quote from probably the Angels' most famous alumni, Rod Serling, who after the war started the TV show, wrote and directed the TV show, The Twilight Zone. And Rod Serling was a member of the 511th. He had been wounded on Luzon, and he wrote this quote about what we now know today as post-traumatic stress. That, of course, was not a term that was used after World War II, but certainly all of the veterans that came back were experiencing some form of that. Serling took the opportunity of writing as a way to excise his demons, and I think this quote sums up his experience and the survivors from World War II as well. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to questions later.
This is Carl Plateau with his brother who served on a minesweeper. Carl grew up outside Philadelphia. His family lost everything in the Depression. But he had an uncle in Minnesota who was a doctor and got Carl into the U of M, in the pre-med program. It was 1942, Carl was 18 years old, and his heart wasn't in it, and he flunked out. He tried to enlist in the Navy, he tried to enlist in the Air Force, but they wouldn't take him because he was slightly colorblind. Paratroopers didn't care, they were glad to have him, and he was assigned to the 11th Airborne Division. If you didn't have total confidence, you couldn't have endured in the jungle. You'd crack up. You'd have stood up and run out of the foxhole. You'd have done crazy things, or you would have quit. But I never saw any of that because the guys were so well prepared. And in front of your buddies, you would never give in. The other thing about it was that you didn't think, you just reacted. You didn't wonder, what am I going to do now? No, you were so disciplined, you just performed. The greatest characteristic of our success was the training of the paratroopers, the discipline, your confidence, your ability to act. It just made it possible for you to live. There's a camaraderie amongst all of us that was just, it was simply beautiful. We were totally interdependent on one another. I saw one guy after Leyte who didn't want to go further. He took his rifle stuck it between his toes and blew his toes off so he wouldn't have to go back to the States. He got court-martialed, got dishonorably discharged, but if the guys would have gotten him, they would have killed him because he betrayed them. In the jungle at night, you'd be 2 hours on and 2 hours off. At night when it started getting dark, like fireflies you'd see on the base of a tree, little fluorescence in the foliage, and you'd memorize that because if anything ever blocked those little lights, you knew there was somebody crawling up. The worst part of it was, it started getting dark at night and you'd hear this, "Hoy, hoy, hoy," and you'd wonder, my God, here we are now, are we going to make it through tonight, or are we all going to be killed tonight? You had a number of hand grenades. You didn't want to shoot your rifle because they'd know where you were from the flash of your rifle. So you'd throw hand grenades at them. And I think that some of them were drunk with sake before they'd make a charge. Japanese were often in caves. That's where the demolition came in. I'd been trained as a demolition man. The flamethrower was the only way to burn them out. You throw a satchel charge in there, or you could throw hand grenades. But the best way was to burn them out, because you could go about 150 feet with that fireball. And you'd hear them scream, and they'd come running out, and the guys would shoot them, pick them off one by one. But they were fierce, they never gave up. So this was the last day. I sat down against a palm tree, and Denapol sat next to me. And he says, "Jesus, we made it." And he tips his helmet back, and all of a sudden a single shot ran out. I looked over, and there was a hole right there, right above his nose. He was gone. We just left him sitting there. We were all so exhausted. Here I was, 126 pounds, in this mud and filth and dirt. We hadn't shaved, limping. At an aid station, they cut my boots off, and my legs began to swell up from the knees down. We called it jungle rot. So about 5 o'clock, this doctor came by and put a piece of cardboard with a big E on it around my neck. Evacuation. He said, "You'll be evacuated tomorrow." This was Christmas Eve. Carl missed the parachute jump onto Tegate Ridge, but eventually rejoined his unit and made the jump on Apari, and he later served in the occupation of Japan. Returning to the U.S., he and 4 or 5 friends went to a famous hotel in San Francisco. The maitre d' said, "Did you just arrive? And where were you?" "We're in the paratroopers," he said. "Okay, your dinners are on us, steak and champagne." After the war, he returned to the University of Minnesota, and he used the GI Bill to study a new field of hospital administration. He went on to build the Fairview Hospital system in Minnesota. I asked him where he ranked his military experiences in his very successful life. "Oh, very, very high. About 20 years ago, I went through a terrible experience. I was president of Fairview. We had an episode in which I was attacked by some people behind the scenes. It was very political. I was almost destroyed in the process. There was a critical dinner meeting held one night with the board of directors in which the charges were leveled against me. I remember sitting there quietly thinking to myself, I've gone through much worse than this. And I actually felt, you guys don't know what you're up against. I've seen much worse. I fought the Imperial Japanese Army." Okay, questions from the audience?
James, we've had a lot of experience. We talked about the glider connection to Minnesota. Minnesota was the second largest manufacturer of gliders. But with the jungles, I mean, I cannot see the utilization of gliders in any of these operations.
So the 11th actually did use gliders in one of their operations. I think it was 5 gliders. It was limited. They used it to bring in artillery and a radio jeep towards the very end of the Luzon campaign. But the main, so you're absolutely right about the terrain was difficult. I mean, they used them a lot in Burma actually, but the weather was the other issue, right? Gliders are made out of wood and tarpaulin, and so the humidity and the torrential rains just wreaked havoc on them, so they were very hard to maintain, let alone use.
James, can you speak to whether the 11th was an all-volunteer division, or were its members drafted, or was it a mix?
Good question. So the the division as a whole was a mix. So the 511th were all volunteers for parachute duty. So they were a mixture of guys that had volunteered to serve and then drafted. And then after they got drafted, anybody who went through jump school volunteered for that as well. A lot of the guys in the glider units, you can imagine your surprise as you've been assigned to an airborne division, then you're assigned to a glider unit. You know, most of these young men had never been in an aircraft, never been off the ground, and now all of a sudden they're in a glider unit where they're going into combat theoretically in an engineless glider, which every landing in a glider is a controlled crash. So it wasn't a very popular assignment in many ways for that.
I'm a 82nd Airborne paratrooper myself, and in sometime during the pandemic, like 2020, 2021, you know, I had a conversation with a friend who was like, well, Airborne, you know, that's a bygone strategy, and I had talked about how it's really rapid deployment, and one of the ways they can land, you know, get there is sometimes jumping, sometimes they land other different ways, and but anyway, I was kind of proven in my argument the following year in June 2022, because the Army reactivated the 11th Airborne Division in Alaska, and I just wanted to mention that, I guess, because I was excited about the 11th Airborne Division and how it helped me win the argument that the Airborne is very important still today, because they wouldn't reactivate it if it wasn't important. So, any comment about that?
First Airborne. Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, when you're attacking or trying to get from point A to point B, you can do it amphibiously or you can fly in, right? And so the flying in is going to get you there faster, theoretically, than troops who are landing on amphibiously on a shore, depending on how deep you're trying to get. So airborne is still very relevant from that perspective. Obviously, it's going to be dependent on the intensity of the conflict and who the other, the anti-aircraft capabilities of the enemy are. But to your point, there's also plenty of times where, you can jump in for humanitarian purposes, air land for, there's a lot of other than high intensity conflict where that capability might come into play. I think the French actually last year dropped a battalion of troops in Africa. So it's still a viable method, and it's good to have in the arsenal.
Well, is the new 11th, is it predominantly helicopter?
You're stretching I think there's definitely a parachute component and then a air mobile component. I can't remember if it's battalion size or, I think it's brigade size actually, but don't quote me on that.
Gotcha. Raise your hand nice and high. Somebody up there? Okay.
You mentioned that they had a training course with the Australians, and I wonder if there are any stories or comments that came out of that with regards to how they apprised the Australians, what they thought of the Australians.
Yeah, interestingly enough, I think they had a very high regard for the Australians. And they also, one of the interesting things that they learned from the Australians was they actually got their hands on a crate of Enfield rifles with scopes. And so one of the things that they came out of that training was they actually deployed snipers after having gone through that Australian jungle warfare school. I guess that was a technique that the Australians were fans of that wasn't something that the 11th had done prior to that. And so they came away with that for a very positive experience and wrapped that technique up into their
Anecdote that came out of the training before the Battle of Alamein, that the 51st Highlander Division was also doing training reps with 8th or 9th Australian Division, and the Highlander officers very quickly became aware of the fact that discipline within the Australians was just a completely different thing. The men didn't salute their officers, they called them by their first names, et cetera, et cetera. Did the 11th notice any of those same sort of things?
It's a good question. I don't recall any anecdotes related to that specifically. Yeah.
That's what happens when you have static electricity.
Brooks, nothing about submarines tonight, okay?
I grab a hold of that metal here first.
Well, that would have been a classified question anyways. Question for you two paratrooper guys, maybe the 82nd guy down here. Are paratroopers seen as shock troops because, you know, the Los Banos drop and all this other stuff? Did MacArthur and other leaders say, well, I mean, the 101st, the 82nd, and, you know, in the Bulge, the 11th Airborne out here in the Philippines, are you airborne guys shock troops separately and differently than normal ground pounder guys or armor guys?
I would say it varies by unit. So I would, you know, make the argument that parachute infantry regiments are very much just like jumping in is a unique way, their unique commute to get into the battle. I think other units, now I think the parachute infantry battalions, when they were first formed in 1941, were definitely intended to be shock troops, right? The intent was that that's what they were, you know, and I'm using the word shock troop, I kind of think of like Ranger battalions as the quintessential shock troops. And so from that perspective, I think that's what I think of as an example of shock troops as opposed to other units that use it as a way to get to where they're going and then fight in a more conventional manner or for longer duration.
Anybody else up here?
There is a submarine anecdote, though, for the 11th Airborne Division. One of the American commanders who was MacArthur's liaison with the guerrillas actually landed by submarine on Luzon. So, throwing you a bone.
You mentioned Rod Sterling, and Rod Sterling, I think he was only about 5'4", wasn't he? And he needed a special waiver to get into the unit. He was probably lighter than the equipment he was carrying.
So a question about what was the post-war careers of Hogan and Swing? Where did they wind up? Did they stay in the Army or what?
So Hogan did not survive the war. He was killed in Luzon. Swing retired as a 4-star general, and then he later ran Eisenhower's equivalent of the border agency.
Any other questions? Is that it? Okay.
Hi, coming.
Yeah.
Here, I can come. Here you go.
So I get asked that sometimes. Sorry about that. When I was in the 82nd Airborne Division, you know, the main thing we were was rapid deployment force, and that's why you always hear the 82nd Airborne's going here and the 82nd's going there. And then the 101st is also a rapid deployment force, so that's why you often hear in the news the 101st has relieved the 82nd Airborne Division like after 6 months or so, or a year. So we were prepared to go anywhere in the world in 18 hours, wheels up on the aircraft in 18 hours or less. So when I went to the Gulf War in 1990, you know, some people when they deploy, they got 6 months or a year to prepare. I had a door knock, and then it was just go, you know, and then you go. And you go to Sea Lock, which is this area that they kind of prepare you, and then, you know, slowly you all get on different crafts, and I got on a C-5, and I went to Saudi Arabia. So, but that's what it is a rapid deployment, and a lot of times they land, you know, and then take the airfield because they don't need to jump. But if they need to jump, they'll jump. So, I'm Tim Engstrom. I'm the editor of the Minnesota Legionnaire, and I was an 82nd Airborne paratrooper at one point.
Support for this program provided by viewers like you. Thank you. Additional support provided through the Catherine B. Anderson Fund of the St. Paul Foundation. Upcoming roundtable topics can be found at www.mn-ww2roundtable.org. Production services provided by Barrows Productions.